Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to our continuing series of virtual author events. We'd like to thank the DeKalb Library Foundation. They are the organization that pays for the Zoom account that allows us to come into your homes this evening so you can enjoy the wonderful author events that we typically would present in public at the Decatur Library and at various other organizations throughout the metropolitan area. We'd also like to remind you that our bookseller this evening is Eagle Eye Bookshops in Decatur. They, of course, already have copies of the Beirut Protocol on hand, and you can purchase those and either pick them up in the store, they can mail them to you, or they can do curbside delivery. We'd like to remind you about all of the wonderful work that the independent bookstores in our area and across the country have done during the pandemic, making sure that we all have access to books that we need, as well as libraries that offer curbside pickup. So this evening, of course, we'd like to remind you that we will have a little talk by our author first, and then if you'd like to ask questions following the presentation, you may either ask them in the Q&A section, or you can put the questions in the chat and we will read them aloud during the presentation. You'll find the Q&A button either at the top of your screen or at the bottom, depending on which device you're using. So right now, we'd like to introduce our author for this evening. Oops, I am so sorry. I closed the wrong window. Give me one moment. Here we go. And we'd also like to say that this is the official book birthday for the Beirut Protocol, an added incentive for you to purchase a copy this evening. Joel C. Rosenberg is the New York Times, USA Today, and Publishers Weekly best-selling author of 16 novels, including The Jerusalem Assassin, The Persian Gamble, The Kremlin Conspiracy, and The Last Jihad, and 5 non-fiction books, including his latest, Enemies and Allies. Among his readers, he counts former President George W. Bush, former CIA Director Porter Goss, former Delta Force Commander General Jerry Boykin, and many other officials and foreign leaders. His career as a political thriller writer was born out of his filmmaking studies at Syracuse University, where he received a bachelor's degree in film drama. He worked for a range of US and Israeli leaders and nonprofit organizations, serving as a policy analyst and communications strategist. As a speaker, Joel has addressed audiences at the White House, Pentagon, the US Capitol, Canadian Parliament, the European Union Parliament, and the Israeli President's Office. An evangelical from Jewish heritage, in 2006, he founded the Joshua Fund, a nonprofit educational and charitable organization that has invested more than $50 million in providing humanitarian relief to Holocaust survivors and the needy in Israel, to Syrian and Israeli refugees, and to strengthening the church in the Middle East. He is also the founder and editor-in-chief of 2 news analysis websites, allisrael.com and allarab.news. He is here tonight to talk about his latest novel, The Beirut Protocol, another Marcus Riker novel. The Secretary of State is headed to the region to seal a deal on a game-changing peace treaty between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Special Agent Marcus Riker is leading an advanced trip along the Israeli-Lebanon border ahead of the Secretary's arrival. But this time he finds himself in a position he has never been in before. Ambushed, captured, and taken behind enemy lines. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Joel C. Rosenberg.
Joe, thank you so much. What a joy to be with you guys, even if it is virtual. I want to bring you greetings from Jerusalem, the holy city. My wife and sons and I, well, 2 of the 4 sons that we have, all 4 sons moved here. We became dual U.S. Israeli citizens. We have citizenship in both countries. I joke that means we get to vote twice. It's kind of like living in Chicago. And so we all moved here, but then the oldest got married, moved back to the States. The next one finished his army service here in the Israeli army up on the Lebanon border. He went back to the United States and he's in college now. The third one has been in an elite special forces unit here in the Israeli Defense Forces. He finishes up this month, Lord willing, inshallah. And he finishes up here, and then trying to figure out what to do next, school, job, what. And the youngest is a sophomore in high school here. So that's a little bit of our context. We moved here to Israel in the summer of 2014. As it happens, it was right in the middle of a rocket war. There were 4,352 rockets and missiles being fired by terrorists in the Gaza Strip at Israel the month that we arrived, August of 2014. And these were just welcome presents, just they want us to feel, welcome, just rolling. That's sort of the terrorist way of rolling out the red carpet. And it's been a fascinating, challenging experience living here in Israel generally, and now in Jerusalem in the last several years. But it is living at the epicenter of the world. This is a country, a city that has been conquered and reconquered, and people have lusted to conquer this city and this country time and time and time again. You go back to the Egyptians and the Pharaohs, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottoman Turks, the British, and I'm not even mentioning them all. So if you're going to write thrillers, if you're going to write political thrillers, if you're going to write about wars and rumors of wars, this is a pretty good place to come because it has been the epicenter of so many momentous events in history. And I don't have any doubt that it will be momentous in the future as well. So now, Joe, you were very nice to introduce me as somebody who worked in politics and worked for U.S. and Israeli leaders. Let me just disclaim that right up front. I'm a failed political consultant. Okay, everybody that I worked for lost. Okay, not a single person that I ever advised won. At one point in the fall of 2000, 20 some years ago now, I was working for then former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu had been Prime Minister of Israel from 1996 to 1999. He lost his reelection, and now he was putting together a comeback campaign team. And I got hired as part of this small team of American advisors to complement his Israeli team. I was based in Washington for all those years. We had not yet moved here to Israel and wouldn't for another 14 years. But I was on that team. Needless to say, anybody who knows Netanyahu's career knows that he did not come back for 9 more years. And at that point, I thought, you know what? I've been doing this for about a decade. And all my friends want me to work for the candidates that they are against, because every time I work for a candidate, they lose. So they're like, Joel, shouldn't you, maybe you have a candidate, but maybe you should choose the other candidate. So what I decided to do was get out of political consulting. I went through political detox. I'm out. I'm clean. Though when it's an election year, sometimes I need a patch. I'll be honest about that. Now, not everybody who writes political thrillers has worked in politics. And not everybody who writes Middle Eastern thrillers has had the opportunity to work for a once and future Prime Minister of Israel and his inner circle. But that's sort of how my career went. And it turned out I was much better at making things up for a living than just, trying to help people win office. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of the backstory. I will get up to the new book soon, the Beirut Protocol, but I want to give you this backstory in case you're not aware of my story. And this is how I got into writing political thrillers. As I said, 10 years of failing in Washington. So I sat down in January of 2001. Okay, that date, that month is important in the story. January 2001. I've got my own little communication strategy company. I'm consulting for various Wall Street leaders, political leaders. Netanyahu had been one of the clients. There had been others, but but I had always wanted to write a political thriller, or at least a novel or a screenplay. But but I was married and I didn't want to become a starving artist in Hollywood. So I moved to Washington, and, I had a fascination of politics. And so I wanted to write a novel. Many of us do. Most of us don't end up doing it. But I thought, what? I have a little bit of time, and I don't know what else to do with my life at the moment. I really don't want to stay in political consulting. So let me write a few chapters. I was going to write the whole book, and my wife said, yeah, maybe write 2-3 chapters, see if they're any good. Before, don't just dive into the pool until there's some water in there. So, okay, that's good advice. So I began writing a novel. The first page of the novel, the book was called The Last Jihad. The first page puts you inside the cockpit of a jet plane that's been hijacked by radical Islamist terrorists, and it's coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. Now, this is almost 9 months before September 11th, 2001, right? I'm starting it at the beginning of the year. This is still far off. I'm not predicting it. I'm certainly not hoping for it. I'm just thinking this would be an interesting way to start a novel. I had remembered reading, admittedly, I am not a big fiction fan. Okay, I'll just put that out there. I know that sounds odd. You sell 5 million copies, New York Times bestseller writer of fiction. You might want to enjoy the genre. I do enjoy it, but I enjoy biography, autobiography, history, political science, political strategy, communication strategy. I enjoy that more. And admittedly, in my political career, there was no time for reading fiction except maybe over the Hanukkah Christmas break. My wife or my sister-in-law would buy me a Tom Clancy thriller or a John Grisham legal thriller. And if I could get through it, I would love it. And then I would go back to work. Well, I remembered a Clancy novel called Debt of Honor. And in that novel, Clancy, he imagines a scenario in which the son of a Japanese war hero, somebody who dies in the war during World War II, and the son has become a 747 pilot for a Japanese airline. And he's filled with bitterness and rage against the American victory. So he plots a attack and carries it out in this novel by Tom Clancy, Debt of Honor, in which he flies a 747 into the United States Capitol building. Now, Clancy had written that years before 9/11. And I had found the novel fascinating, chilling, especially since at the time we lived, a few blocks away from the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. But I didn't feel like it was realistic. And Clancy was a master, so don't get me wrong. The guy had sold bazillions of copies. But this particular story didn't ring true. Why? Because I just didn't believe that someone would be motivated to commit not just suicide, but murder based on the kamikaze ideology. It was almost a religion at the time of worshiping the emperor of Japan in a conflict that had been, 50, 60 years earlier. But I had been working for Netanyahu. I've been working for Israelis, and I've been really immersing myself in Israeli politics and Middle Eastern history. I'd studied, as Joe mentioned, at Tel Aviv University for a season, 6 months, and I was just fascinated with the history, the war, the wars, many wars, and how leaders make decisions. So one of the things that Netanyahu had said, and let me just make it clear, I don't agree with everything that Netanyahu believed then or believes now. I haven't even seen him in person, as a meeting in a decade. I don't have a personal friendship or relationship with him. So, but at the time, Netanyahu's big point to American officials was this: we in Israel are being hit and being attacked all the time by people who are driven by a radical Islamist theology. It's really a political ideology in the guise of a religion. Not all Muslims want to strap a suicide bomber vest to them and go blow themselves up in a cafe or a bus or a school, or, you know, that the vast majority of Muslims don't believe that. But there are Islamists who are using violence to accomplish their political objectives. Okay. And Netanyahu said, you know, we're basically facing this all the time here in Israel. And he told Americans when he came to Washington for a joint session of Congress, for testifying before Congress on TV shows, radio, he said, listen, in the mindset of these radical Islamists, Israel is only the little Satan in their religious and political worldview. We're the little Satan in Israel. America is the great Satan. In other words, Israel is not the main target. Ultimately, the ultimate objective of this small but deadly group of terrorists, of evil people, is to annihilate, not just inflict damage to, but annihilate the United States of America. Okay, so I was processing that. And the more I studied, the more I could tell that, yes, that is true. That is what they believe. That's what these leaders say. So what if? And so I took that debt of honor concept and I said, I think the motive in the 21st century, the motive that would be strong enough inside of you to hijack an airplane and turn it into a missile and fly it into an American city, whichever city that is, has to be much deeper than a 60 or 70-year-old, you know, vendetta against the United States from World War II. And thus I thought, you know, this is, we're seeing smaller examples of this in the Middle East all the time. What if a group of radical Islamist terrorists hijacked a plane and flew it into an American city? I thought that would make a really interesting novel. Now, that was just the opening chapters of The Last Jihad. As I kept thinking, well, where does this story go? I thought, well, what if an American president who was reeling with his country from this attack, what if he scanned the Middle East and he said, listen, I can unleash American military forces against these radical Islamist terrorist cells, but what about a state, a regime in the Middle East that actively funds, supports, and trains these types of terrorists? What about a regime that not only trains and funds terrorists, but has used weapons of mass destruction in the past and claims to have them now? This drew my attention to Saddam Hussein. And as it happens, I decided, well, what if? All right, so what if a kamikaze-like attack on the United States at the beginning of a novel leads to an American president going to war to remove Saddam Hussein from power? Okay, now set aside for a moment whatever political views you have about whether that was the right decision, the wrong decision. Think of it as a novelist and dial yourself back to January of 1941. You're thinking, you know, I'm a young guy, I want to write my first novel. What if the Imperial Japanese wanted to inflict damage on the United States? What if they plotted some sort of attack against some island that the United States owns? Maybe it's Midway or Guam, or I don't know, maybe even as far as Pearl Harbor. And then what if that sets into motion a global war in which the United States decides to drop 2 nuclear weapons on Japan to win? Now, you're not predicting it. You don't want it to happen. You can't even imagine that it would really happen. But what if? And that's what a good political thriller starts with. Every political thriller writer needs to start with a premise, which is a what if premise. The premise has to be chilling enough that you're like, oh my gosh, that's a horrifying thought. But it also has to be plausible enough that, you know, you think, I hope that never happens, but what if it did? And that's what I was doing. That's what I was trying to do. And then 9/11 happened. When The Last Jihad released was actually November of 2002. So more than a year had passed since the 9/11 attacks. But when that novel came out, it was right in the thick of a massive national debate. Should we go to war to remove Saddam Hussein or not? And again, regardless of your own personal political feelings, imagine having a novel that's the first novel of its kind, right? Every other thriller writer, led by Tom Clancy, we had been dealing with the Cold War, right? We were dealing with the Russians and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And that's why Clancy was looking at Japan, or he's trying to figure out who are the new enemies of the 21st century. But very few writers had dealt with radical Islamism, and nobody had dealt with a kamikaze attack that leads to war with Iraq. On September 12th, 13th, 14th, as everyone trying to figure out what the new world looked like, suddenly I was the only one with a novel that was done, except no one had ever heard of me, and nobody cared, except my agent. And one thing led to another, and when that novel released in in November of 2002, it became just a huge bestseller. #1 on Amazon, 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, 160 radio and television and newspaper and print interviews in less than 60 days. I mean, it just like my career went from 0 to 160 in like 3.3 seconds. It was just like I didn't have a career, and now I was, a best-selling author. And what has happened over time is that I started to get a reputation for writing about what seemed to be stories that were ripped out of tomorrow's headlines. I'll give you one other example. The next book was called The Last Days. It was about the last days of Yasser Arafat, the PLO terrorist leader here in the Middle East. The U.S. News and World Report did a story just as my novel released in the spring of 2003. And the article was called Modern Nostradamus. Okay. And the U.S. News and World Report was calling me a Nostradamus, and they were saying they explained that whole story of the Last Jihad. And they said, now in Rosenberg's new book, the book opens with a U.S. diplomatic convoy driving into Gaza as part of the peace process when it's suddenly attacked by terrorists. And they said that, 6 days before the novel released, a U.S. diplomatic convoy heading into Gaza was attacked by terrorists. And so they were saying that I was sort of, prophetic or prescient or psychic or something, right? I mean, none of those things are true, by the way. But and then the article said, "Watch out, Yasser Arafat. Rosenberg offs you," on page, whatever it was, 43. About 13 months later, Arafat was dead. And again, this sort of weird sense of Joel sort of writing about events that could happen, but they seem to happen, or something close to them. So I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point, if you're interested in sort of, more details related to that. But let me just say that the new novel, as I mentioned, is the Beirut Protocol. And yes, it is just out today in hardcover. I actually literally just got mine yesterday because I'm in Jerusalem. I'm in Jerusalem because the airport here is closed. Because of COVID, no Israelis can leave the country except under emergency circumstances or come back. Now, they're just beginning to figure out how to reopen, but at the moment, I couldn't come do a book tour. So that was kind of disappointing, but that's why we're doing everything from today going forward virtually. But the Beirut Protocol is the latest novel, and it's out in hardcover, ebook, as well as audio. And I love audiobooks because I do enjoy fiction. I don't love it as much as other things, but I do enjoy it. And I love listening to these books on audio because I don't really have time with all the other things going on to read as many novels as I now would like. But let me just set this up. As Joe mentioned, the main character in this new series is a guy named Marcus Riker. Now, when I sat down to plot out a new series, this is now the fourth in the series. and you can read this one first. You don't have to have gone back. You'll know exactly what's happening from the get-go. But and then if you like it, you can double back and and go through the whole series. But Marcus Riker, I only knew two things about him when I sat down with a yellow legal pad and a pen and thought, I'm coming up with a new character, a new series. Who is this guy? And there was two things I knew. The one thing was, I want Marcus to be a former Secret Service agent. Why? Well, I wanted him to be, I didn't want him to be an assassin. Okay. Jason Bourne is an assassin. Vince Flynn's lead character, Mitch Rapp, assassin. Brad Thor's main character, an assassin. An assassin is a great thriller character, right? Because they're hunting for bad guys. Totally legitimate, not something I would want to do myself, but it's a legitimate need within a national security, infrastructure. But because other writers have done it so well, I didn't want to do that, and I also, I don't want to be a hunter. I don't want to be an assassin. So I wanted to make him, by personality and by training, someone whose life is committed to protecting people. Okay, so he's a Marine who signs up because he sees 9/11. He's a senior in college. He sees this happen. He goes to the Marine recruiting station. He says, I want to hunt down. In this case, he does want to hunt down, but he wants to protect his country. But he wants to bring Bin Laden's head back on a platter from Afghanistan. Okay, and so he trains. He serves in the Marines in combat in Afghanistan, in Iraq. He's wounded in battle. He's a hero. He's awarded numerous times. He ends up joining the United States Secret Service and rises to the elite presidential protective detail. Why? Because he wants to protect. That's his training. That's his skill set. He can kill someone in an instant. You don't want to get in his way if you're a bad guy. But his training and his personality is that he wants to protect. Well, I wanted him to be a former Secret Service agent. I wanted him to have the skill sets, but I wanted him to be out of government service. Why? Because the other thing I just instinctually thought about it. It wasn't a plan, but I wanted him to be a widower. He has lost his wife and his only child, a son, in a terrible convenience store robbery turned murder where he wasn't even there. And so what Marcus Riker has in him is this incredible high-level skill set, but he also has deep grief because he spent his entire life defending his country and its leaders, and he wasn't able to defend and protect the people closest to him. And that's a wound in him. And so that's how I began. Because I wanted him, I don't want him to be a superhero. I don't want him to be somebody ripped out of a DC comic or the Marvel universe. I wanted him to be a highly trained operative who is dealing with some of his own ghosts and demons. But I also wanted to do one other thing. I wanted to put him in very dangerous circumstances and pull him back into government service. Now he works for the Central Intelligence Agency. And as Joe mentioned, the whole thing begins as he's doing, Marcus and his team is doing an advance trip to make sure everything's safe on the Israeli-Lebanon border for the Secretary of State, who's coming the next day and wants to get a briefing, wants to tour that border and wants a briefing on the threat posed by Iran and Iran's main terrorist proxy force in Lebanon, known as Hezbollah. Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles aimed at Israel. And God forbid, Iran tells Hezbollah one day, unleash the whole arsenal. We would have thousands and thousands and thousands of missiles raining down on us every single day. It's a horrifying proposition. It is the most likely possibility of a war in 2021 in real life. But that is the premise. How might that happen? And when you have someone as trained as Marcus Riker with incredible skills, but he's ambushed and taken hostage, and pulled deep behind enemy lines. Now what does he do? From the books 1, 2, and 3, the Kremlin conspiracy, the Persian gamble, the Jerusalem assassin, we know his skill sets. But when we get to the Persian gamble, those have all been neutralized, and he is now being held and tortured. Does he get out? How would he get out? If he can get out, what about his teammates who've also been captured? Does he run without them? Are they capable of running? He's got a lot of moral questions and ethical questions he's got to wrestle with. And meanwhile, there's a massive war blowing up in the Middle East. Let me stop there. That gives you sort of a sense of a little bit of who I am, for better or for worse, and a little bit about the Beirut Protocol. And let's see if I've made you all drift off to sleep, or maybe some of you have some questions.
Well, speaking of drift off to sleep, it's, what is it now? A little after 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in Israel right now for you?
2:30 in the morning here in Jerusalem. But I'm good. I've got some coffee. Happy to do it.
Excellent. Well, just a reminder, folks, if you'd like to ask questions, either type them into the Q&A feature or go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and ask Joel those questions for you all. Real quick, just to get us rolling, Joel, and in talking about your writing style, you talked about Marcus Riker and kind of like the backstory you built for that character. But, looking at your body of work, and thinking of like Brad Thor and Vince Flynn and Robert Ludlum with their characters, you also have J.B. Collins and John Bennett and David Shirazi. And, as a fiction writer, how do you view these, and almost like a parent too, these are 4 more of your children, with each of these books, with different personalities and things like that. Do you?
I hope not, because some of them I kill off. I don't want you to
okay,
ever
well, there you go.
I don't want you to ever read a Joel Rosenberg novel and think that he wouldn't take out any character at any time. I want to keep you on the edge of your seat. And I've done that to some of my most beloved characters. But anyway, back to you.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, and that's a good question too to add, because when Elizabeth George, killed one of her characters off, I mean, that lit a firestorm. And I actually was at the event at the Margaret Mitchell House in Atlanta when that book came out, and she gave her talk, and first question right out of the gate, some woman stood up and literally just exasperately threw down her hands.
Spoiler alert.
How could you? And I mean, it was like a lead balloon in that room with that question. But she said
that's why you want to do virtual, and then you just turn the video off and you're like, good night, I'm out.
But going back to you have these 4 characters, and looking at how you describe Marcus Riker too, I mean, that's a lot of development. And how much time do you put into creating these people? Do you go in kind of knowing what you want the character to be in order to build the particular story framework and the world they're going to inhabit in these books?
Yeah, those are good questions. Let me break them apart and kind of deal with them sort of one by one. The first thing to say is that most successful thriller writers choose a franchise character. One character, him or her, they're going to create this character and they're going to write that main character for the rest of their life, right? If you're Ian Fleming, you write James Bond. You don't write James Bond and then his brother Bob. It's James Bond. Like now, and so if you're Lee Child, you write Jack Reacher. That's your character. And when somebody loves that character or hates that character, that's the character. Like for the next, then they'll want to read every single book, even if they come in at book 22. They want to dial back and read the series. Essentially it's the literary version of binge watching Netflix, right? You want to read all of them. Now I guess I'm not an unsuccessful thriller writer, but I took a different path, and that is I wrote a series of 5. That was the Last Jihad series, and then I wrote a series of 3, and I wrote a series of 3, and I wrote a series of 3, And I didn't do what everybody else has done. And commercially, I probably should have, but I don't regret it because those are stories I wanted to tell. And the way I wanted to tell them didn't require the next 30 years of my life telling the same character. But I will tell you, two of those main characters were interesting. Like the first one, John Bennett was a Wall Street strategist. He's the chief investment strategist for a global hedge fund, who then is friends with a governor who becomes the president of the United States. And it's that president who sort of hires John out of Wall Street and says, I want you to come and work for me at the White House and put together a big Middle East peace deal. And so John is not a trained killer. He's not a Secret Service agent. He's not a Marine. He's not a hunter killer. He's a Wall Street strategist. I put him in 5 very dangerous books, but there's only a point of, there's only a certain distance you can go with someone who doesn't have the skill sets that would obviously be in a dangerous circumstance, right? So 5 was about as much as I could get out of John. And John wasn't even a classic hero. He was more of Frodo than anybody else. He didn't want to be involved in this. He wasn't trained to be involved in this, but fate, as it were, pulled him in, just like little Frodo. He's a hobbit. He's just, he's got big feet, big hairy feet. He just likes hanging out with his friends in the Shire. He doesn't want to go to Mordor and, deal with Mount Doom or anything, but how many books did we get out of that, right? It didn't go on forever. Although they did make a couple $1 billion films, so that we could all be so lucky. Another character I had in my more recent series was a guy named J.B. Collins. You mentioned him. He's a New York Times foreign correspondent. And what makes him interesting to me is he's not working for the CIA. He's working for the New York Times. But one of the things that a New York Times foreign correspondent does, he's still an intelligence operative. He's still trying to get information from good guys and from bad guys. In the series, the Third Target, The First Hostage, and Without Warning, that series was about J.B. Collins sneaking into civil war strewn Syria to find the head of the Islamic State, ISIS, and get an interview, write a profile. The difference between a New York Times foreign correspondent and a CIA operative is not that they're both going to get information, but one, their information winds up on the front page of a newspaper for all the world to see. The other, if they both live, the other writes a report that may or may not even reach the director of the CIA, much less the president of the United States. So a New York Times reporter is essentially hiding in plain sight, but it's incredibly dangerous, incredibly risky. But how many novels can you write about a foreign correspondent? Especially if, in a world where, a lot of people hate the New York Times. A lot of people love the New York Times, but I'm just saying there's a point of no return. So that's why when I started a new character, a new series, I thought, you know what? I also don't want people to get stuck in thinking I'm writing a series of trilogies or, 3, 4, 5 novels. This could go on. I want to keep people on edge. I don't want people to know what I'm going to do. So I need a new series. So I want someone who's trained, who everybody believes as you watch him unfold. This guy has got incredible skill sets. But I didn't want him to be a caricature. I wanted him to have a backstory that with pain that he has to overcome. And, like I said, battling with the pain of doing that, but also trying to stay focused on the mission at hand. So that's probably a longer answer to only part of your question. I'm happy to go in deeper on the other ones, but that's sort of at least a broad swath at your
Oh,
question.
yeah. Well, let's give it a minute because we do have about 10 questions that folks have.
Great, I'll try to give shorter answers.
Yeah. And it seems that they're going to break into 2 groups. It seems there's a little bit of politics and there's a little bit of character. And it seems that a lot of people have some really good questions about your characters,
Okay.
because I think they may have caught that same thing that I did about it. So just so everyone knows, we
Lead
have
the way,
about,
and we'll dive in.
and I'll combine the ones that are similar. So on the character of Riker, an attendee asks, do we see more novels featuring him? And then another attendee asks, Marcus is a grieving widower, but he needs a woman in his life. While it may be a bit tougher as a prisoner behind enemy lines, please tell us, is there at least a chance for him to find love again?
Okay. So the first one, so what was the first one again, though?
Do we see more novels?
Oh, more novels. Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, this is the fourth in the Riker series, and the fact that this exists, a lot of my fans are like, "Wow, that we literally had no idea that you were going to continue on," because we've just gotten this mindset that they're trilogies. So that's been fun. But I'm already writing the fifth novel, so you at least know that Riker doesn't die in this book. I'm not going to tell you he's not brutalized, but he doesn't die. Spoiler alert. But yes, I'm intrigued with this character. To me, this is the character I have found most interesting. And I reserve the right to kill him, but I don't want to. And I'm intrigued with taking him down the road. So again, the key to this one was I've got 3 novels now under my belt with Marcus, and we see him as, this guy kicks butt. Like he has really been used in very key moments. He's not just an action hero. He's a strategist, and he is helping advise the American government against what the CIA director and other senior officials are thinking. We should do this. And Riker's like, no, you should do that. And sometimes Riker's in the field and he makes a different decision than what the guys at the headquarters want him to do. But he's the operative, and he keeps being proven right, but sometimes barely. So we see that. But again, in this one, I thought we need to see him in a situation that he can't use most of his skill sets. But we need to neutralize him, and we need to put him in danger. People are starting to like him. Good. He's always in danger, but this is, I've written, 16 novels now. I've never had one be captured and tortured. So that was new. And how do you keep that story going if, that could become very static. So anyway, yes, I think he's going to go on for a while. I won't predict how long, but I'm intrigued with him. Now, in terms of love, this is something that he battles with. Now, you can't look, a thriller is not a Nicholas Sparks novel, okay? Every novel has drama, right? And one's love life, more than likely, you're going to have some drama. You like the girl, is she going to like you? You ask her, she says no, whatever. That's, but I'm not writing Pride and Prejudice here. And I'm not writing Nicholas Sparks. So the life of a Secret Service agent, right? Secret Service agents are not verbose people. They're trained to protect, and they're trained to take a bullet for the president. They're trained to kill, but they're mostly trained to stand in a darkened hotel lobby all night long doing nothing. It's the craziest job in the world, where you're trained, your entire professional career is about sheer boredom interrupted by 9 seconds of sheer terror. And you have to be ready instantly to throw your life in front of a bullet of a president you may despise personally and politically. It really is a fascinating thing. And that type of character is not a person who's like probably going to be very chatty, right? They will have an inner life, but and he doesn't have time working for the Central Intelligence Agency to, go to the Cineplex, even if it were open right now. First of all, how do you date, you know, in the age of COVID, right? And, you know, love in the age of cholera, right? I mean, you know, it's a crazy world suddenly. But yes, what I've done over the course of the 4 books is I've planted women characters who are strong. These are strong women. Marcus will never be attracted to a wallflower. But so he's got people that work, you know, that are colleagues. He's got people that are maybe not colleagues in the agency, but in other forms of government who are intelligence analysts or whatever. And I started to plant these characters, and I wanted them as strong, and I want them to be key players. They're not, you know, sitting there waiting by the phone, hoping that Romeo calls. Like, these are players. But I don't even know which one he's going to go for. Now, in this one, in the Beirut Protocol, I'll just say some things start to move. A glacier begins to move, and I'm not going to tell you what's going on, but I've been asked that question for a while, and I'm not even going to say that it's going to work, but something starts to happen in this book with one of the women characters and him that was an option, but wasn't something he had done something about before now. Let's stop there, because otherwise I may say too much.
Excellent. Well, we'll move out of character and on to sort of like writing process, because that's
Sure.
Another series of questions that we have. So I'm going to combine 2, but both of these folks ask, as an author, do you keep normal business hours, or do sometimes you pull all-nighters? And then Kevin asks, when you start a series, do you outline the story so that it takes several books in order to tell the full story, or do you only outline book by book, and then start thinking of a storyline for another character? Or do you think of stories in multiple books at one time?
Those are great questions. All right. So the first one, I wouldn't say normal business hours, because I became an author mainly so I could sleep in. Okay, I don't want to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and as an author, I don't really have to. Although for you, Joe, and those who are watching from the Georgia Center of the book, yes, I'm up at 2:45 in the morning, so I'm pulling an all-nighter. So I don't want to do regular hours. So that's the one thing. My writing day is usually, I love to get up and ease into the day, but then I'm really reading the news. And I'm making some notes, but by 10 o'clock, I want to be writing, and I want to be, and I have to turn off the news and sort of, because when you're a novelist, you're creating a fictional universe, right? Now, mine is drawn on a lot of research, but let's be honest, when you sit down and you start to write a novel, you are asking someone to spend $28 of money they'd rather not spend, and several days of their life of free time they may not have, for something that's completely not true. It's an insane concept for a job. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. You know, what value am I providing? No, now I'm, you know, I hope some, but it is an interesting concept. And when you sit there with a blank screen, you know, I tell young writers that when the cursor is just sitting there and it's just daring you, I dare you, Joel, to fill up 100,000 words and try to get someone to spend $28 on it. Now, I'm Jewish. I'd never spend $28. I don't, you know, I don't pay retail. First, I'd go to the library. So God bless the library system. My parents, I literally grew up with people. My parents didn't have any money. It was the 70s, and you know they were just struggling, and you know, with inflation and gas prices. And I mean, if I didn't have a local public library, I wouldn't have read a book except in school. But I lived at the library, but I always lost my card, so I would leave it there. They would let you, at least for me, they would let me keep my little library card at the library, so I didn't have to carry it around because I would always lose it. But I love the library. But you know. But I'd also like everyone here to actually buy a book too. Yes, get it at the library. That's a lovely thought. But you know, my kids need you to buy it at a bookstore. So that local independent bookstop that you mentioned, that sounds lovely. I'd love to go there and encourage you to go there. But all that to say, it's this crazy concept to create a fictional world. And for me, I have to exit the real world and immerse myself. And any email or phone call, this just pops me out of that world, and it's hard to re-immerse. And again, I'm not just writing, I'm not just writing novels just for my regular fans. I love that. That's who I write for. But I have world leaders reading these books. I have the King of Jordan is reading my novels. The former president of the United States, George W. Bush, reading my novels. Mike Pence. Now Mike has a little more time on his hands, and so does Mike Pompeo. But they were reading my novels before they became the Secretary of State and the head of the CIA and the vice president. But world leaders are reading these books, and that raises the bar, right? Why should they take extra time in their life that they don't have and go read a political thriller? So it's difficult, and it makes me sweat. Your job, everybody that you're on here, it works much harder than me, but that's the weird world that I have. So that's that question. And then the second question was related to
about outlining your books.
Outlining, yeah.
Do you vision multiple books to tell the story, or singular portions of the story?
When I first started with The Last Jihad, for example, I wrote, I think, like a 30 or 40 page treatment, like a very detailed outline, because I wasn't sure I could do it. I wasn't sure if I could plot out an entire political thriller and know where I was going. I really needed detail. And I also knew where I hoped that the overall geopolitical story would go. You never know when you're writing your first novel if you're going to get a chance to write a second, much less a third and a fourth and a fifth. But I did have a story that and it was much more story driven and geopolitical plot driven than character. I hadn't spent enough time on developing my characters. I still think it's interesting, but those aren't. And Last Jihad will always be my favorite book because it's my first. But you'll see a lot of flaws, and I hope that my craft is improving over time. I will say in this one, I do not plot this thing out. Many books, I know who this character is now, and I figure out the geopolitical scenario I'm going to put he and his colleagues in. But I literally wake up every morning. I mean, I know a couple key moments that are going to happen, but I wake up in terror. What does my character do today? Because I don't want to know ahead of time, because I'm afraid if I have thought it through in too much detail, it might be obvious. And I might not even realize that it's an obvious choice. I want to wake up in sheer terror. What am I going to write today? Because if I don't know, you probably don't know. And that's where things start to happen. And I think, what keeps me from being bored today? Let's kill that guy. Let's blow that up. Let's have him. Oh, I never thought about her. She should stab that guy in the back. She should be a mole. I never thought about, and because I'm always trying to keep it interesting day after day, just for myself. I don't really write these for other people. I write them for me because I have to enjoy it. If I don't enjoy it, why should you?
So let's move on, because we do have some questions about, on the other side, about politics and things like that. So Tom asks, will you continue to reference the Bible and maintain the connection to Christianity in your stories?
Well, that's an interesting question because, to some degree, yes, but you'll see some series, it's a faith and even prophecy, biblical events that haven't happened yet that are going to happen, I believe. And I think, well, wouldn't that be an interesting scenario? What if it happened in our lifetime, those set of things? I have written some series like that. One of them was called the Damascus Countdown, because there's a prophecy. There's actually two prophecies in the Old Testament of the Bible that say that Damascus will be obliterated, annihilated as a city sometime in the future. It hasn't happened so far. Damascus is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. So I thought, well, what might lead up to that prophecy playing out? The Bible doesn't say how we're going to get there, but that seemed interesting to me. And I try to make these books, accessible and interesting and thrilling for people who have no interest in the Bible. But I do have it, my own personal faith, both as a Jewish person, but also as an evangelical. But the current series, so most of my lead characters are not Christians. I do that on purpose because they're conflicted, and they're not, one is a Muslim. David Shirazi is a Muslim, and he goes on a very interesting journey as an Iranian whose family escaped out of Iran during the 1979 revolution. David himself was born and raised in Syracuse, New York. That happens to be where I'm from too, though I wasn't born to an Iranian family or a Muslim family. But anyway, he ends up working for the CIA and going into Iran as an undercover agent. So I found that fascinating, to try to get in the mindset of somebody very different from me, except that he is from Syracuse. Anyway, the current series, Marcus Riker is a follower of Christ, but he's a quiet person. He's not, he's not out there. He's not a preacher. He's not he's not leading Bible studies. It informs his life and his ethics, but it's not on his sleeve. And so he's an interesting character because I want to have a faith element in these books because it's important to me, but also because I used to read Tom Clancy novels, and I love those novels. Eventually they got a little long and too much language and too much sex for me personally, but it was almost like nobody edited them anymore. He's just so successful. Just let it, to publish whatever he writes. Okay. I don't believe in that. Although, that would be fun, I guess, as a writer, but nobody edits you. But no, I want the discipline of being edited. But the point is, no, people were dying all the time in Tom Clancy novels, and yet nobody seemed to be bothered by that. I mean, I'm not saying that every page should be, these aren't sermons. These are thrillers, right? But if you write about life and death, if you write about war and terror, somebody at some point is going to think, well, if I do take a bullet for the president, what happens to me the second after I die? Like, isn't that a thing? We all wonder that. It seems weird to me in thrillers where people are dying that nobody seems to be bothered. I mean, they're bothered that they may be sad that their friend dies, but it doesn't seem to generate any questions like, do I really want to jump off into eternity, like jumping off a 50-story building without knowing that I have a parachute on my back? Like that seems like an important thing to wrestle through. So some of my characters do, some of them don't. Some of them are highly anti-religious. Some are from very different types of religions. And I try to make that interesting. And it's an element, I guess, in my novels that really are probably not part of most other thriller writers. Certainly not the ones that I compete with. My colleagues who are, the Daniel Silvas and the, Grisham occasionally will have a spiritual element. He is a Christian, but it's not a dominant element to his books by any means. Anyway, so very few thriller writers deal with the spiritual.
So kind of dovetailing into that, and in talking about, politics and belief and the like, Tom also asks, is there pressure on you as an author to maintain political correctness, or is there an increasing social pressure to align with excessive political correctness?
I don't feel any pressure. I mean, one of the benefits of being a best-selling author is you have a little more freedom. I don't want to be I don't want to be abandoned and not have someone edit me and challenge me and say, we should take 15% out of this text. It's just too long. Like, let's get this thing streamlined so it's sharp and it keeps moving. I need that. But I don't have anybody telling me you can't say that. It's interesting. Again, if you think of the major thriller writers, the New York Times bestselling, the biggest names in my genre, if you're in the political thriller, spy novel, military thriller, that genre, I'm competing against people who are using a lot of language that I don't personally feel comfortable with, so I don't use it. I will have to cheat by saying, exploded in a, profanity or whatever, but I don't use the language. I'm not using sexual scenes. And you take those two elements out, and you've taken about 25% of most novels in my world out of the story, and arguably some of the draw for some people. So I'm already dealing with that. Then I'm dealing with trying to have sometimes some of my characters, going on some sort of spiritual journey, and these aren't Billy Graham crusades. I mean, but they're processing, they're wrestling through themselves, some of them. And so that's a huge thing. And if those things, that is not politically correct if you reverse the world, you'd be like, that's crazy. What are you doing? That is not commercially viable. Those are the books I want to write. And I don't see anybody screaming at me that I'm not using enough vulgarity or not enough people are dropping into bed with it. If you don't like violence, my books are not for you. I mean, to be honest. So I think what I'm doing is not politically correct, but nobody's stopping me. Maybe someday they will, but right now, I'm getting to write what I want, and I'll take it while I can get it.
So we've got two more, and I'm going to read these almost exact because
okay.
One of them is it definitely has some direct political questions about your book. So Marnie asks, you write books involving political violence and tension while living in a politically tense area of the world. How do you maintain balance in your life? And then we have a question about, Joel, when you refer to Israel's actual weaponry and military assets, are they factual in terms of statistics that you have gained in-person knowledge from interactions with the IDF, Mossad, Shin Bet, example, etc., for your books?
Oh, wow. Fun questions. Okay. So balance. You're right. I'm dealing with evil, right? And it's one thing, you got to make your protagonist, your hero, a three-dimensional character. But you also have to make your enemy a three-dimensional character. You have to create someone who is evil, but you also have to see over his shoulder or her shoulder as they plot and strategize. You have to at least try to understand, what are they trying to do? And the theme of many of my novels is this: to misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided by it. Let me just say that again. To misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided by it, right? Americans were blindsided by the Imperial Japanese on December 7th, 1941. We didn't think the Japanese wanted to hit us at Pearl Harbor. We didn't think they could do it. We got hit. We didn't see it coming, right? We were blindsided. We were blindsided on 9/11, and that whole 9/11 Commission report, the summary of it, I read the entire report multiple times. I'm telling you, the summary is that the criticism of the commission was that 9/11, those attacks were not so much a failure of intelligence, they were a failure of imagination. That's a direct quote. Meaning, no one could quite imagine people hijacking a plane and turning it into a missile. Well, I did. I mean, it was possible to do it. It's just that our government didn't. So maybe they need to turn to some novelists to think through, what could happen. So I deal with evil, and I remember to find balance, you've got to be centered in your own family, in your friends. You got to learn to laugh. I remember when Steven Spielberg was filming in Poland, he was filming Schindler's List, right? This epic story of the Holocaust. And it was so grim and it was so dark every single day. I mean, it was fiction, he was, but he's making this film that's so realistic. And he actually called up Jerry Seinfeld He said, Jerry, I need to laugh every night when I finish this shoot. I can't, it's killing me. Could you send, this was before Seinfeld had put his sitcom on DVD. He said, would you put these on VHS or whatever it is and ship them to me? I need to watch a Seinfeld every night before I go to bed. And so I love to laugh, and I love to shift gears. And my family and I, is a lot of what we do is just, get into the real world, first of all, but also laugh. So those would be my two things about finding balance. And of course, my faith is hugely important to me. And that's where we find balance. And then the military, by the way, whoever said that knows all of our security services. Listen, I have had, well, first of all, Google is the best friend of the novelist, right? It used to be you'd have to really go to the library. Well, this is still a good thing, but, thank God Google hasn't been a library killer, but for research, to be able to quick look up a weapon is good. I'm not someone who is trained. Brad Thor loves weapons. He loves guns. God bless him. I've never shot a Beretta in my life, right? So I have to look them up, and sometimes I get them wrong because I assume something has a safety, and somebody writes me, "You moron!" How could you not? So, but if it's a missile system, if it's plane, I have to make sure that I've done my research, or that I cheat a little bit. And I don't get so technical that I get myself in a trap of an area I don't know. I'm not writing techno thrillers, and I'm not writing military thrillers, really. I'm writing political thrillers because geopolitical scenarios, that's more my specialty than each weapon system. But it is true that I've also developed a wide range of sources and friends who can help me. You mentioned Jerry Boykin. He's the former commander of Delta Force. He's a personal friend. My son, before he went into special forces here in Israel, went out to his farm back in the States and went shooting and learned to shoot from the head of Delta. Like, that's a good way to go. And so he becomes a great source and former CIA directors and Israeli military officials. The former head of Israeli military intelligence has become a friend here in Israel. So I try to tap resources that I didn't used to have when I first started writing novels. But over time, as more and more people have read the novels and become fans, or at least not enemies, they have been more willing to be helpful. But all the mistakes I own, and I'm still learning how to do it. I will say the last thing is, I very specifically not asked my sons to give me insights into their world, because I don't want to put them at risk of saying things that are either classified or just sensitive. We just don't talk about, they work on classified things where they can't tell me, and I don't want them to get in trouble. Oh, so you're feeding everything to your dad. No, I don't want to get them in trouble, and I don't want to be in trouble, so there you go.
Well, I know it's getting late there, so really quick, I want to remind folks that they can get a copy of the Beirut Protocol from Eagle Eye Books. Also, don't forget that Joel has a new nonfiction book, Enemies and Allies, that's out as well, that you may want to...
Not out yet. That comes out in September for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And that looks at who are our enemies these days, 20 years after 9/11, and who are our allies in this crazy part of the world. And there are exclusive interviews with all these major leaders in the Arab world, Israel, and top leaders in the United States. So that's September.
Excellent. No, but we'll use that to bridge this question, because Graham had asked, from the onset, that what you enjoy most about writing thrillers, and clearly from talking to you this evening and seeing your great humor and your love of your characters and in your research, you truly enjoy this particular genre. But what is it about, you do bridge, fiction, nonfiction. You talked earlier about, reading nonfiction and sort of like, reading fiction maybe as like a palate cleanser, but at the same time, you were dropping, so you had some Tolkien references for your characters. You had Tom Clancy, who even my 88-year-old paternal grandmother read Tom Clancy religiously. although, you know, yeah, Tom Clancy sometimes got a little racy, and I was like, I can't believe I bought that book for my grandmother. You know, but all things forgiven. So what, you know, how do you view yourself as a fiction thriller writer and view yourself as a nonfiction writer, especially with this book coming out, Enemies and Allies, and you know, that seems to be, it's going to be a big political book, and you know, definitely something that people are going to sink their teeth into, coming on to, you know, 20 years after 9/11.
You know, Joe, it's a good question. If I could do it, if I could just write what I really wanted to, I would just write nonfiction, because as I told you, that's the world that I live in. That, you know, and I've actually started these two websites you mentioned, All Israel News and All Arab News. I'm actually, you know, and you know, we had 1 million views last month. We're growing. We're getting interviews with the president of Israel, the defense minister of Israel, the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, the president of the United States, the vice president, the secretary of state. It's been fascinating, and part of it, I love to do that because that is also research for nonfiction books and for novels, actually. So if I could, I would just write nonfiction. But the truth is, my fiction is much more popular than my nonfiction. And the nonfiction does well. I haven't written, however, a nonfiction book in 8 years. This Enemies and Allies will be my first. And but the thing is that I have found that most people don't want to be educated. They want to be entertained. Now, when it comes to the Middle East, they know it's important and they know they should know more than they do. They should understand more, but it's hard because life is busy and they don't want to pick up a 900-page history book of the history of the Middle East. They don't want to pick up a dusty tome about radical Islamic theology or, God forbid, eschatology. I mean, it just seems all like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. Don't make me. It's like going to school. They don't want that. My wife and I have friends who they have 4 sons. We have 4 sons. But when the kids were little, the kids in that family, they didn't like to eat protein. They just wanted, you know, cookies and ice cream and, you know, whatever, cakes. And they didn't want it. You know, you set meatloaf in front of them, they weren't going to eat it. So the wife, the mom, she would make them smoothies. And when they weren't looking, she would throw in some leftover meatloaf into the smoothie, and she would whip it up. And they didn't even know. And this was her way of sneaking in some protein, and they didn't even get it. So that's what I'm doing. You know, if I set out to educate, there'll be some people who are interested, but most people won't be interested. But if you can keep them all up all night, if you grab them, if their heart is pounding, if their pulse is spiking, if they've got beads of sweat, if it's 4 o'clock in the morning, if it's 5 o'clock in the morning, if the sun is beginning to come up and they're still reading, and then they're like, oh, and they start cursing me on Twitter, on Facebook, Joel, I got to go to work, I got to go to school, I got to get the kids ready, you moron, you horrible person, you kept me up all night. Good, I'm doing my job. I'm a thriller writer. And if I don't thrill you, I don't earn the right to do anything else. And yet, if I can entertain you and educate you without you fully realizing it, or maybe you realize it, but you appreciate it because it wasn't school. It was exciting, and you were learning things because the character needed to know it, not because Joel decided to teach it to you. This is a great way to learn about a region of the world that is the most volatile and has, you know, drives up our price of gas. You know, it takes our sons and daughters to war. It changes our stock markets, our retirement saving. You know, so much of the world revolves about what happens here in the Middle East. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And so I just have found that people would prefer to be entertained. And while it's harder for me, it's more difficult to write a really interesting political thriller, it sells more and it therefore accomplishes more. It's not the financial gain, although that's fun. I want to have an impact. There's no point in sitting in a room for 6 months, not seeing anybody, just writing, unless it's going to get read, unless it's going to get used, unless, and Natan Sharansky, the great Jewish human rights activist who escaped, was 9 years in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, and then became the deputy prime minister of Israel. I worked for him years ago, and he said back when in the Soviet Union, when you weren't allowed to have your own books, they would hand copy books of the of Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, and they said the books must work. Don't leave them on the shelf. Make them work. They need to be read. Otherwise, what's the point? And so that's what I'm trying to do, is write books that people will read. And you can navel gaze all you want, pontificate, but if you write a book and nobody reads it, you literally have cut down a tree in the forest and no one heard it. So what's the point? Even as an environmentalist, much less as a writer, you really shouldn't be chopping down trees for no purpose. Yeah, I would write nonfiction alone if I could, but I make myself write these novels, and I do love it. It's just tougher because, like I said, it's a crazy concept to try to persuade someone to spend, okay, maybe not $28, maybe they're gonna, get it, on from a store for, a significant discount, but it's still hard-earned money, and it's hard-earned time that people don't really have extra discretionary time and money. So you need to earn it. And that's hard.
Well, thank you so very much, Joel. This was so entertaining and informative, and I think a great way to celebrate the book birthday of the Beirut Protocol. We'd love to have you back for Enemies and Allies. I think that would be great to have that kind of a nonfiction talk. And I always say that sometimes other people's words are so much better than mine to wrap things up or to do introductions. So I'm just going to go ahead and steal this great comment from one of your readers who's here tonight, Kevin. And he says, "Thank you, Joel. Your stories have blessed me over so many sleepless nights when I couldn't close the book without knowing what comes next. Your books are definitely page turners. Thank you for continually stretching our imaginations." So,
well, that's very kind. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, everybody who watched tonight and who will watch on YouTube. It really is, it's a lot of fun. And if I'm going to stay up late at night, it needs to be fun and interesting. So you guys have made it that way, and I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Joel. Stay safe. We hope to one day have to see you in person here in Georgia for a talk. But until then, stay safe, everyone at home. And let's go ahead and keep on doing what we're doing to get us through this pandemic. Thank you all so very much, and we'll see you again very, very soon.
Thank you.